Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Alondra Nelson, president of the Social Science Research Council, and I am delighted to welcome you to this afternoon's conversation, Electoral Anxieties, November 3rd and its Aftermaths. We are delighted to have a group of distinguished panelists and interlocutors this afternoon who will, I think, help many of us think about the pending election and indeed all of the anxiety around it. Here at the SSRC, we have a cluster of work around technology and politics and media in particular. And in that work, we really are interrogating the relationships between those three areas and the kind of ubiquity of digital communication, uneven democratic participation, heightened polarization, factors of social life in which we are with which we are all contending at present. Within that cluster of work, since our highly successful Anxieties of Democracy program, that program is motivated by a concern about whether the core institutions of representative democracies can capably address large problems in the public interest. And we are delighted to have with us today two of the three co-chairs of that program here at the Social Science Research Council, who I'm pleased to introduce now. John Ferejohn is the Samuel Tilden Professor of Law at New York University. His primary areas of scholarly interest are political theory and the study of political institutions and behavior. He has held fellowships with the Brookings Institution, the Guggenheim Foundation, the Center for Advanced Study at the University of Illinois, and the Center for Advanced Study of the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford. He's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the National Academy of Sciences. He is the author of Pork Barrel Politics and a co-author of The Personal Vote, Forged Through Fire, and A Republic of Statues. He has written numerous scholarly articles scholarly articles in the areas of political science, economics, and philosophy, as well as volumes on information and democratic processes, constitutional culture and democratic rule, and the new federalism, Can the States Be Trusted? He has also served on the Board of Trustees of the Russell Sage Foundation and the Brennan Center of Law, as well as on the editorial board of several scholarly journals. Thank you and welcome, John. Co-chair of the Anxieties of Democracy program is Deborah Yashar, professor of politics and international affairs at Princeton University and editor of World Politics Journal. Her research interests include regime politics, citizenship rights, social movements, ethnic politics, state formation, violence, and immigration politics. She is the author of 3 books, Homicidal Ecologies, Illicit Economies and Complicit States in Latin America, Contesting Citizenship in Latin America, The Rise of Indigenous Movements and the Post-Liberal Challenge, and Demanding Democracy, Reform and Reaction in Costa Rica and Guatemala. She serves on several editorial boards, including the American Political Science Review, Perspectives on Politics, and Cambridge Studies in Contentious Politics. And she's also edited several volumes and is the author of numerous articles as well. So we're going to proceed with some remarks from our distinguished panelists, and then John and Deborah will begin a Q&A for us, a discussion for us, and that will then take to draw the audience into. So let me introduce our speakers. They're going to speak for about 10 minutes. I'm going to pose a kind of high-level question to them to begin. And they're going to speak in turn, and then we'll have the conversation with myself, John, and Deborah amongst the group, and then the Q&A. So Hahrie Han is the inaugural director of the SNF Agora Institute, a professor of political science and faculty director of the P3 Research Lab at Johns Hopkins University. She specializes in the study of organizing, movements, civic engagement, and democracy. Her newest book, which I had the great pleasure of reading, will be published by the University of Chicago Press in fall 2020, entitled Prisms of the People, Power and Organizing in 21st Century America. She has previously published 3 books, How Organizations Develop Activists, Civic Associations and Leadership in the 21st Century, Groundbreakers, How Obama's 2.2 million volunteers transformed campaigning in America, and Move to Action, Motivation, Participation, and Inequality in American Politics. Her award-winning work has also been published in the American Political Science Review, the American Sociological Review, the American Journal of Sociology, and numerous other public outlets, including the New York Times and the Washington Post. Stephen Levitsky is the David Rockefeller Professor of Latin American Studies and Professor of Government at Harvard University. He currently serves as the director of Harvard's David Rockefeller Center in Latin American Studies. His research focuses on democratization and authoritarianism, political parties, and weak and informal institutions with a regional focus on Latin America. He is co-author with Daniel Ziblatt of How Democracies Die, which was a New York Times bestseller and has been published in 22 languages. He is also author of Transforming Labor-Based Parties in Latin America, Argentine Peronism and Comparative Perspective, and co-author with Luke and Wei of Comparative Authoritarianism, Hybrid Regimes After the Cold War, and with Daniel Brinks and Vicky Murillo, Understanding Institutional Weakness, Power and Design in Latin American Institutions. He is editor or co-editor as well of several volumes, including most recently, The Politics of Institutional Weakness in Latin America and The Inclusionary Turn, Democracy and Citizenship in Latin America. Professor Levitsky has also written for the New York Times, Foreign Affairs, The New Republic, and other publications. Rick Pildes is the Sudler Family Professor of Constitutional Law at NYU Law School. He is one of the country's leading experts on legal aspects of American democracy, elections, and government, an elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Law Institute. Professor Pildes also has been honored as a Guggenheim Fellow and a Carnegie Scholar. He is the author, his two textbooks, The Law of Democracy and When Elections Go Bad, created the field of the law of democracy, a field of inquiry in law schools around the world. He has published more than 70 academic articles and has successfully argued voting rights cases before the Supreme Court. Professor Pildes has taught at Harvard, Yale, Chicago, and Michigan law schools, in addition to his current position at NYU. He graduated Harvard Law School magna cum laude and Princeton University summa cum laude and was a law clerk to Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall. So thank you all for being here, and thank you to our audience for indulging those introductions. I wanted to, as Aretha Franklin would say, give everyone their propers, because we're so honored to have such a distinguished group of colleagues here with us today to discuss these critical issues about the upcoming election. So with that, we're going to turn things over to Hahrie Han, and as I said, she, Professor Levitsky, and Professor Pildes will speak in turn, and then John and Deborah will get us started in a conversation. Hahrie?
Thank you. Thank you to Alondra and to the whole team at the SSRC for convening us and inviting me to be part of this discussion today. I'm really looking forward to learning from everyone else on this panel and learning from what I'm sure will be a rich and lively discussion. So to start with, the question that was posed to us is to think about what this election tells us about US democracy in general, and what in particular worries us as we're thinking about both the election and what comes thereafter. And I wanted to start by sort of kind of making the point that no matter what happens in the election, we're all going to have to figure out how to get out from under the rubble. And so in a sense, there's this key question about how do we begin to do that? And if we think about any kind of representative or constitutional democracy as an interlocking system of three things, right, of the political institutions that structure our political lives, mass public participation or political behavior, and then civic culture and norms that knit those things together, I wanted to focus particularly on the side of public participation and norms, which I think are really knit together by civil society, and think about where are the places where we are strong and where are the places where we're weak. And also to say that as I look around at where we are in civil society right now, the thing that concerns me most about this election is the fact that people have so little trust in so many institutions in our civil society and in our public lives in general. And I think there are two particular anxieties in this round that I want to highlight. First is just on the side of political participation, what we see is that there's what I think of as a broken link between participation and responsive political institutions. And that's a crisis of democratic legitimacy, right? So if we look at the data, then what we see is that the relationship between public opinion on a lot of issues for most people and responsiveness of government basically is a flat line, right? The sort of theory of government of, by, and for the people is that you'd see that there's some relationship that as people begin to become more supportive of an issue, that government responds in a lot of ways. But that's not necessarily the trend that we've been seeing. And I think that we're seeing people react to that, not only in the United States, but all over the world, where there's this outpouring of protest in democratic societies around the world, because people are feeling like the ways in which they traditionally exercise voice are not necessarily reaching them towards the kind of outcomes that they want. So if we start with that broken link, the second thing that worries me about civil society is a sort of sense that there's this breakdown of norms, right? And you don't need me to necessarily rehearse all those with you, but as we, the thing that worries me the most as I look around at the data is a sense that people's level of support for democracy as a system itself is declining. And so people are less and less willing to defend that system itself. And this is not unrelated to that first crisis of legitimacy. For democracy to work, people have to be willing to accept a certain level of uncertainty over outcomes in order to protect the process of democracy itself. But when that means that people are getting put in the position of having to do things like many people were at the beginning of the pandemic of choosing between hunger and health, then people's willingness to tolerate that uncertainty goes down. So as I think about the sort of moment after the election, one of the scenarios that I'm very concerned about is this notion that there are many scenarios, I think, where we're going to have this moment of uncertainty that could easily lead to a lot of chaos. And I know that probably some of my other panelists will talk about that. But in that moment of uncertainty, I think civil society becomes really important as a potential glue to sort of hold us together. And the question I have is civil society strong enough right now to be able to do that? And so if we imagine that in the United States, people talk about how there have been several foundings, right? There's obviously the constitutional period and the founding after the Civil War and potentially one after the Civil Rights Movement. It's possible that we're in this moment now where we need another founding, right? And another sort of renewal of our democracy. And that's one that needs to operate not only at the level of reforming political institutions, but also at the level of renewing the levels of commitment that people are willing to make to each other, and to grapple with the question of to whom we're willing to make those commitments. And so what does that mean for what we need to do after the election? So I want to sort of kind of highlight three characteristics that I would like to put on the table for what we would need to do to kind of rebuild after the election. And they all have to do with what I think of as the supply side of civil society, right? So if we start from the premise that citizens, or in the conceptual sense of the word, not in terms of legal standing, right, are made and not born, meaning that people don't come out of the womb with all the capacities they need for citizenship, with commitments to norms of liberal democracy and so on and so forth. But instead, those commitments are cultivated through civil society. And the capacities that people need to be able to exercise power and voice are also cultivated through civil society. Then the question is, what are the kind of spaces that we need to create to be able to enable those commitments to norms, those kind of behaviors, and so on? And how have those become emaciated or hollowed over time? Why are we struggling with those questions right now? And so the three things that I want to sort of think about is, first of all, as we think about civil society, right, as we think about the kind of campaigns that touch people's lives, the organizations that invite people to become a part of them, to engage with public life in different ways, we have to pay special attention to the characteristics of the kind of spaces that people are invited into. So I think one of the things that we're learning is that not all of those spaces are the same. I think a lot of times as scholars, we often tend to black box civil society itself. So it's like people come in, we assume they emerge from these Tocquevillian schools of democracy with a set of capacities, but we haven't necessarily done a lot to think about what the characteristics are within those. And what we're seeing now is that as the different kinds of spaces are changing in many, many ways, we have to better understand the question of what that black box looks like. So what are some of the characteristics? So first, in civil society, does belonging come before belief, or does belief come before belonging? So what I mean by that is that in general, we assume that people are drawn into civic spaces that are concordant with the political interests that they might have, right? So the idea is, if I'm an environmental organization, what I'm gonna do is reach out to other environmentalists to get them to engage with me, right? If I am a political organization, if I'm a political campaign, for example, I'm gonna reach out and try to get other people who support my candidate to come out and join us. And that's how most of our civil society is set up. But the question is, does that have to be so? I think that one of the things that we're seeing as we look at spaces, digital spaces where you see conspiracy theories, burgeoning political campaigns and other kinds of and advocacy organizations that are drawing people into them. One of the trends that I feel like is becoming more important is this idea that, in fact, belonging in a lot of ways comes before belief. So that people are drawn into these spaces, not necessarily because they share the political agenda that's at stake, but because it creates a community of relationship, of meaning and commitment for those people, and then people's beliefs about the political issues that are at stake begin to evolve. And so, particularly as we think about this sort of uncertain world that we're living in right now, a lot of the different kind of spaces in civil society that we have this potential to help people make sense of that uncertain world. And the question that I would pose is that we know that there are a lot of faith institutions, right? There are a lot of digital institutions right now that some scholars have proven to be the place that draw people in who are most disaffected. Those are the places where people are going to make sense of the world. Do we have the similar kind of institutions in political or civic spaces that are doing the same thing? Do we have the same kind of spaces that draw people into communities of belonging and help them make sense of the uncertain world that exists? So that's sort of one question. The second question, as we think about the characteristics of civil society that we need, is can we pay more attention to what I think of as the political economy of tolerance? So in order for democracy to work, right, we need tolerance of diverse and divergent views. It's fundamental to making democracy work in all sorts of ways. And we've seen lots of ways in which that's in decline over time. And the question I would ask is, how is that related to people's sense of voice and responsiveness in government overall? So if we think back to the challenge of the broken link between participation and power, what is the extent to which people are less likely to be tolerant of difference when their sense that their own voice is in decline is threatened? And can we create alternate spaces in civil society where people who feel like they don't have voice can actually exercise voice? And in my mind, this means creating spaces in civil society where people are treated as more than just data points for input, but instead are invited to actually exercise agency and having some kind of governance or some kind of say over the directions that those those civil society organizations go. And that's the kind of thing that we used to see historically that has really declined in many ways over time. And so what ends up happening is that when people see their candidates lose or their policy preferences not get enacted in government, they have no alternate spaces through which they can begin to exercise voice. And so if we think that democracy rests on this idea of having a plurality of spaces through which people can exercise voice, is there a way in which people's willingness to engage with the system is related to the extent to which that plurality exists or not? And how does that relate to people's sense of tolerance overall? So that's sort of the second characteristic that I'd want to think about. And then the third and the last is just the question of who gets to belong, right? In some ways, the big question that's confronting our society right now is who deserves dignity and who gets to decide. And given the demographic changes that we see in our society, in my mind, the central challenge that we have is this question of whether or not we're able to create a multiracial solidarity or not. And the things that I think I would challenge those of us who think about civil society to think about in that space is, right now, the ways in which we think about solidarity tend to be pretty thin, right? That very often it's about creating coalitions that are relatively transactional, that often obscure the power inequities between people, and veer groups that are non-dominant majorities into sort of notions of assimilation. And solidarity, in contrast, I would say, is a recognition of the mutual value that is derived from exchanging interests and resources across groups of people, so that people that two groups, if we think of power, right, as being an exchange of interests and resources, right, and so that we create power together when, when we each use our resources to act on each other's interests, and that starts by equally valuing the interests of all the groups that are involved. And so the question is, most of the research that we have on civil society organizations that try to create that kind of solidarity is that they're very bad at doing so in most cases. And so the question is, can civil society create spaces that allow for the full recognition and valuing of each other's interests and resources? And so when I think about kind of what's, I'll just sort of end by saying, like, when I think about the likely scenarios of November, after November 3rd, then it seems to me that the thing that I feel surest about is that there's going to be some period of chaos. Exactly what the nature of that chaos is going to be like and how it's going to unfold, I think, is unclear. But I'm confident that the extent to which we're able to sort of see our way through it is going to depend not only on the strength of our political institutions, but also on the strength of civil society to be able to help us navigate through questions of trust, questions of tolerance, questions of commitment to each other that we're going to need. And so I hope that we're able to rethink some of the characteristics of the kind of civil society that we want to create so that we can navigate through these kind of challenges.
Thank you very much, Harley. That was excellent. And I look forward in the discussion to talking about this kind of thick solidarity and how to think about that in the midst of potential chaos. So next we'll hear from Steve Levitsky.
Hey, everybody. First of all, thanks to Alondra and John and Deborah and the SSRC for putting together this extraordinary project. It's also an honor to be here with Hahrie and Rick, who are two outstanding scholars and public intellectuals. I was asked, I think, to sort of compare the US election coming up to crisis-ridden elections or crisis-ridden democracies elsewhere, sort of comparative electoral anxieties. And I think there are some important ways in which the US right now is worse off than some other democracies. Unlike many other democracies, including in Latin America, which is a region that I study, we have very few mechanisms, formal or informal, to deal with electoral disputes. In Latin America, most democracies have independent electoral authorities. Civil servants administer elections, nonpartisan authorities count the ballots, deliver results, and resolve disputes. We've got virtually none of that infrastructure, mainly because we haven't needed it much in recent decades, or at least for good parts of our history, certainly excluding the Jim Crow period. The stakes around elections weren't all that high. Elections were not always that close. The stakes weren't always that high. So we could rely on forbearance. We could rely on state and local officials not taking advantage of their positions to help their party win. We could rely on parties not going all out to exploit loopholes in the letter of the law in order to subvert the spirit of the law. We could rely on candidates not cheating and seeing if our lax system of oversight would allow them to get away with it. But now the context has changed. We've entered a period of pretty extreme partisan polarization, which has created strong incentives to abandon forbearance. When politics is so polarized that we view a victory by our partisan rivals as something that is catastrophic, as something that is beyond the pale, we grow tempted to use any means necessary to prevent that from happening. I want to emphasize this point for a second. Democracy requires that parties know how to lose. That means when we lose an election, we accept defeat, we go home, we get drunk, we regroup, and we get up the next day to play another day. But for that to happen, for parties to lose graciously, which is the name some use for this norm, two conditions pretty much have to hold. First of all, parties have to believe that they stand a chance of winning again in the future. And second, parties have to believe that losing will not bring ruinous consequences. When politicians fear that they're not going to be able to win future elections, or when they fear that defeat is going to bring catastrophe, the stakes rise. Politicians' time horizons narrow, and in essence, they throw tomorrow to the wind and try to win at any cost today. In other words, desperation leads politicians to play dirty. Think very briefly about Southern Democrats after the Civil War. Reconstruction of the 15th Amendment brought widespread Black enfranchisement. African Americans constituted either an outright majority or a near majority in most Southern states. So their enfranchisement scared the bejesus out of Southern Democrats and their constituencies. Not only did Black suffrage threaten Southern Democrats' electoral dominance, but it threatened potentially to overthrow the entire racial order. Facing what they perceived to be an existential threat, Democrats opted to play dirty. Between 1885 and 1908, all 11 post-Confederate states passed laws that used or allowed the use of poll taxes, literacy tests, property and residency requirements to effectively eliminate African American voting rights. So Black turnout in the South fell from 61% in 1880 to just 2% in 1912. In effect, unwilling to lose, Democrats stripped the right to vote from nearly half the population, ushering in nearly a century of authoritarianism in the US South. I fear that a similar set of circumstances faces US Republicans today. Republicans are an overwhelmingly white Christian party, but white Christians are a fairly rapidly declining share of the US electorate. And that has made it harder and harder for Republicans to win national elections. But the problem is not just that Republicans potentially face dim electoral prospects. It's that in the context of an increasingly diverse society, their base has come to view defeat as catastrophic. Many Republican voters, not all, many Republican voters feel like the country that they grew up in is being taken away from them. The very idea of a white Christian America seems to be slipping away. And for many, that feels like an existential threat. So the Republican base is radicalized. And like the old Southern Democrats, Republicans have begun to play dirty. Forbearance has been replaced, is increasingly replaced by a win at any cost mentality. Our system was not built for this. Situation is exacerbated by a couple of things. First of all, an important chunk of the Republican base is both armed and prone to conspiracy theories, which leaves us, I think, unusually prone to political violence. We've already gotten a taste of political violence this summer. The United States suffered 3 political killings in August, 2 in Kenosha, 1 in Portland. Healthy democracies generally do not suffer political killings. And second of all, we've got a president who is willing to tweet anything without regard for consequence. There is a good chance, I think, without exaggerating, that Trump tweets at some point on election day or the day after that the election is being stolen from him, and that there's a coup unfolding against him. He may also order election officials, even though there's no sort of legal basis for this, he may order election officials to stop counting mail-in ballots. How Trump's armed supporters or how Republican officials at the local level respond to those tweets on election day, I think is anybody's guess. And it's not clear that we have the institutional capacity to deal with this. So I think that the likelihood of an election day crisis is pretty high. That said, I think our longer term prospects are much better, at least more favorable to democracy. I think the distribution of power in US society is likely to work against anything like a Trumpist autocracy. Unlike Russia, unlike Hungary, Turkey, Venezuela, where autocrats effectively steamrolled a weak opposition, the United States has a strong opposition. The US opposition is unified, it's well organized, it's well financed, it is electorally viable. The United States also obviously has a pretty powerful independent media and private sector, much of which is concentrated in blue states. In fact, the vast bulk of financial and cultural capital in this country is concentrated in blue states. US also continues to have pretty robust institutional constraints in important areas: federalism, independent judiciary, and crucially, civilian control over the military. Unlike governments elsewhere, unlike governments in Venezuela, Thailand, El Salvador, Philippines, maybe Brazil, Trump almost certainly cannot deploy the military behind an authoritarian adventure of any kind. So that also affects the balance of power. So this distribution of power suggests, at least to me, that we're unlikely to see a slide into any sort of Putin or Chavez or Orban-like autocracy. So the risk of a short-term crisis, I think, is strikingly high. The risk of a slide into a Trumpian autocracy, I think, remains pretty low, much lower than in places like Venezuela or Hungary, Poland, Russia, Turkey. That doesn't mean all is well. And in concluding, I want to point to two, what I think are two fairly serious medium-term problems. The first is severe dysfunction Again, our constitutional system is not built for extreme polarization and highly disciplined parties. That is a recipe for deadlock and dysfunction. And this has real consequences over time. Hahrie already pointed to some of these consequences. The percentage of Americans who say they are dissatisfied with our democracy has risen from below 25% in 2000 to more than 50% today. That's going to weigh heavily eventually. The second medium-term problem that we face is minority rule. As you all know, our system was designed to favor sparsely populated territories. The Electoral College is biased towards sparsely populated states. The Senate is heavily biased towards sparsely populated states. And because the Senate approves Supreme Court nominees, the Supreme Court is also biased toward sparsely populated states. For most of our history, that institutional bias, it was good for Vermont, bad for New York, but it had little partisan effect because both major parties had urban and rural wings. But today, we now face a pretty pronounced urban-rural split. The Democrats are overwhelmingly based in metropolitan centers. The Republicans are increasingly based in sparsely populated territories. That means that the Republicans, through no fault of their own, have a systematic advantage in the Electoral College, the Senate, and the Supreme Court. That's a real problem. Recent US elections fly in the face of majority rule. Republicans won the popular vote once in the last 20 years. They've controlled the presidency for 12 of those 20 years. Democrats easily won more overall votes for the Senate in 2016 and 2018, yet Republicans hold 53 out of 100 seats. This is minority rule. An electoral majority will almost certainly not be enough for Democrats to win the presidency this year, according to estimates by Nate Silver. If Biden wins the popular vote by 2 points, there's an 80% chance Trump wins the presidency. If Biden wins by 3 points, Trump is still more likely to win. Biden's got to win by 6 points to have a virtual lock on the presidency. Senate is even more biased. According to Nate Silver, Democrats have to consistently win the popular vote by 7 points in order to assure a Senate majority. Not only is that arrangement deeply undemocratic, but the combination of severe dysfunction, a system of checks and balances, particularly under divided government, that cannot get anything done, and minority rule is almost certain to erode public trust in the system in short order. I see 2 ways out. Either the Republicans broaden their electoral base and cease to be a white Christian party that's prone to ethno-nationalist extremism, or we reform our institutions to allow our emerging multiracial democratic majority to govern. Absent either of those things, I think we're headed for some trouble. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Steve. That was sobering and clarifying. Rick, you're up next. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me to the conversation here. I want to thank Alondra, Deborah, John, Steve. It's really an honor to be with all of you here on this panel. I thought I would at least start by trying to calm your anxieties about democracy a bit. But I know that because we're academics, many of us at some level prefer to be anxious. And so if you're worried about that, don't worry, I'll give you plenty to feed that side as well. But in looking at the election and where we stand right now, from a big picture perspective, I want to draw the lens back away from the things that are in the media every day right now about court cases, about drop boxes or absentee ballot deadlines or all of these specific issues, and remind you of some of the big things that have actually changed successfully already for this election to adapt it to create access and opportunity for participation even under the stresses we face from the virus. So first of all, if you think back to the spring and summer, the big issue was, were we going to shift to a system in which most voters would be able to vote by mail if they chose to do that? And that issue was successfully navigated fairly easily, much more easily than some of the political rhetoric might suggest. We are now at a point where 45 states are permitting every voter who prefers to vote by mail-in ballot to be able to vote by mail-in ballot. Most of that did not happen through litigation. Most of that happened as a result of legislatures controlled either by Republicans or Democrats in all but these 5 states, making changes to the system if they were states that didn't permit mail-in voting or only permitted it for very limited specific reasons, like you would be out of the jurisdiction. All of those have moved, almost all of those have moved to mail-in absentee, no excuse voting. The president's rhetoric about universal mail-in voting was always a sideshow to this issue, in my view, because what the president was condemning, although his rhetoric was very sweeping at some moments, but when he talked about universal mail-in voting and all the other Republican leadership who talked about universal mail-in voting and condemned it, they were talking about a system that very few states use and very few states were ever going to use for this fall. So universal mail-in voting means the state sends out ballots, absentee ballots, to everyone on the voter rolls. No excuse absentee voting means you must request the ballot. And the fight this fall was always going to be about no excuse absentee voting. Only 4 states have decided to go to universal mail-in voting this fall, but the rest of the states opened up the process through no excuse absentee voting. The second thing, which has not gotten a lot of attention nationally, I don't think, is we have seen dramatic expansions in the opportunity for early voting this election, including states that before this fall did not permit early voting at all. So just to give you 2 quick examples, Kentucky and South Carolina normally do not permit any early voting. This year, Kentucky is going to have for this fall 3 weeks of early voting. That was actually a bipartisan deal there. South Carolina is going to have nearly a month of early voting. And even Texas, which has been in the news a lot for various ballot-related controversies on politics and litigation, in Texas, which is one of the 5 states that does require a voter to have an excuse to vote absentee, the governor there, by executive order, expanded early voting by nearly a week. So that Texas has 2.5 weeks of early voting. And he actually did that over the objections of the state Republican Party, which in fact took him to court and lost on that. And you see the effect of these changes already in what we're seeing with this massive use of early in-person voting and no excuse absentee voting. And all indications are now, as of this moment, that we are going to have the highest turnout election we have had since 1908 for the presidential election, which is all the more remarkable because, as many of you I'm sure know, after we lowered the voting age by constitutional amendment, starting in the 1972 election, turnout has been even lower systematically since young people have voted at disproportionately lower levels than older voters. So yes, we still have controversies about issues like the receipt deadline for absentee ballots, recent Supreme Court cases on those issues. These issues do affect individual voters, but in terms of the overall perspective on the system and where we are now, we do think we are going to have massive turnout, and it's partly the result not just of how motivated voters are, but the expansion and opportunities given the circumstances that the virus pressed on the system. So that's the sort of calmer perspective. Now, the more anxious perspective is consistent with some of what Steve said. And let me put some numbers on a couple of his points and add a few more into the mix. I was very involved in the 2000 election dispute, the Bush v. Gore dispute. And if we got to the point of having a very close election that would then inevitably become disputed, 2000 is going to look like a picnic compared to what would happen in the climate that we unfortunately are in. As Steve said, one reason is many people on both sides believe this election is existential. If you look at polling data on this, 85% of people say it really matters who wins this election, with only 16% saying things will be pretty much the same either way. That's higher than it's ever been since this question has been polled. Back in 2000, 50% said it really mattered. 44% said things wouldn't change that much either way. Second, Steve didn't mention this, but many people on both sides are already primed today to believe the election will be stolen or rigged if their candidate loses. 65% of Biden supporters believe Trump will cheat to win. 51% of Trump supporters believe Biden will cheat to win. About 25% of voters on each side say already the only way their candidate can win is if the election is rigged. Obviously, candidates have fueled this narrative, and it's not just President Trump. Joe Biden said this 10 days ago or so, exactly this line, the only way I can lose is if the election is rigged. Now, he faced a lot of pushback, and he actually retracted that statement, but it gives you a window into the political culture of the moment. I completely agree with what Steve said, that we lack the institutional structures that have broad legitimacy to help us resolve in a way that would be widely accepted any significant dispute that arose. We have relied very much on our courts, kind of by default, because as Steve said, we never created the kind of independent election dispute resolution institutions that many democracies created much later than ours did form. And in our hyper-polarized political culture, the courts have been swept into this polarized perception, at least, about every institution that exercises political authority in the United States. So many people, of course, believe and will believe a court decision that comes out against their side must be for partisan reasons. And I think that's sort of baked in. We all know about social media and how quickly it is going to fuel conspiracy stories, sinister stories about motivations and partisan manipulations and dark, corners if we get into a disputed election. And the numbers on risk of violence, which of course Steve did mention also, are really shocking to me. So in a September 1st Gallup poll, and these numbers have been going up every month this election cycle as Gallup has polled this, 44% of Republicans and 41% of Democrats believe that at least a little violence would be justified if the other side wins. Now, I'm sure we're going to spend some time talking about the paths that might open up if the election is close, what those disputes would look like, what institutions would be involved in resolving that to the extent it can be resolved. And I also do want to mention, I'll stop here, but in the questions and conversation, we can talk about this a bit. I think at the end of the day, there's more reason to think we will know much more on election night or by the next morning than a lot of the commentary suggests with the language of election week or election month. And I'll tell you more to return a little bit to the more calming side of the story, maybe when we talk further, because I don't want to go beyond my 10 minutes. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Rick. So I'd like to invite all the panelists to come to our virtual stage here and for further conversation. So we're going to, Deborah and John, our co-chairs of the Anxiety of Democracy program, are going to get us started in conversation. And I want to invite those of you who are joining us to post your questions and the Q&A as we're getting started in the discussion. So we'll spend 15 minutes or so in conversation with the panelists, and then we'll open things up to others who are joining the conversation.
Shall I start?
Please, John. Thank you.
Okay. These are three just really impressive presentations, and I'm not sure how to feel. I guess I'm still feeling anxious in spite of Rick's calming words. But I have questions for everybody, but I want to start with Hahrie's presentation, and because she talked about civil society structures in a way that, well, in light of current events, I'm just curious how she thinks about these things. So how do you think about whether civil society is really part of the problem? In other words, civil society institutions like the Proud Boys or militias, or I mean, that's the whole set of organizations and associations, which I think you're probably right. I mean, maybe the ideas of the belongingness, are mutually enforcing, and the belongingness comes first. But whatever, they're armed, So, and these are probably among the people who think violence is justified tactically, as well as in response to events that look bad to them. So, and I don't think it's just them. I mean, there's a lot of this kind of highly mobilized things that come out of a kind of polarization that has converted people into the views, which I think Steve talked about and Rick kind of implied, in which they see the other side as enemies, as not just as opponents, not people who are going to allow things to go forward if they win. So I'm just wondering whether civil society in that kind of a world is going to be more of a solution to problems of this kind, these crisis-related problems, than a source of further division. That's my question.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the kind of like the bottom line answer that I would give is that not all civil society is the same. And I think that like one of the big challenges that we have as scholars actually is I think that we are not very good at differentiating between different kinds of civil society, right? So yes, the Proud Boys are a civic, if you want to call it that, depending on what normative valence you attach to civic, but like, they are a sort of like informal collective space in which people gather, right? And it does have very detrimental effects for democracy overall. That's absolutely true. I think that because we don't necessarily differentiate with different forms of civil society, then what ends up happening is that the places where people are invited that do promote the kind of ideological and political extremism that you're pointing to are treated both from a institutional political perspective and from a scholarly perspective as the same, right? And part of what I want to kind of put forth is I think there actually are important differences between those different kinds of organizations, and the extent to which we as scholars, right, or political leaders in general are able to sort of differentiate between those two, the better we're able to kind of strengthen the kind of civil society that we need. And so a couple kind of specific points, on the examples that you give is, so like I was just talking to a scholar who studies organizations like Proud Boys, and he's using kind of like, the point that he makes is that he has really high resolution into these groups, because you can kind of get into these online communities and you can see every interaction that happens, right? And when you look at all those interactions, what you see is that very often what happens, of all the people who come in, about a quarter of them get engaged in these online communities and stay for a long time. About a quarter drop out after about a year, about a quarter after about 6 months, and then a quarter of them will have 1 or 2 interactions and then leave and never come back, And who are the people that really stay over time? It's the people that come and they sort of say, gosh, I've got this like thing in my life that I don't know how to interpret, right? And then someone gives them back sort of like a narrative that helps them make sense of this thing going on in their life. And it could be anything from something political to something like, no one will date me, or something that sort of is very personal. And so there's a way in which they begin, this like worldview begins to get shaped by these kinds of communities that are created that sort of relate to sort of persistence over time. And so where are the kind of political spaces that people begin to sort of develop the kind of worldviews? And then, here I'd point to some of the research by people like Theda Skocpol, who've looked historically, and sort of said that, in the past, we used to have a lot more of these kind of cross-class sort of organizations that had structures that existed both in local communities where people gathered, but also kind of structured up to national politics, so that people felt like they had these meaningful places where they could engage with each other. And that's a very different kind of civil society than the kind of organizations that we have now. So, so I'll just, I just feel like that there's more work that we can do to differentiate between the different kinds of characteristics of the kinds of organizations that we want, knowing that civil society in some places in the ways that you describe is absolutely problematic. So.
Great. Well, maybe I can jump in here. I just want to join John and Alondra in thanking Hahrie and Steve and Rick for not just being here, but for these really excellent presentations, and to say that I'm also so glad that John asked that question, because I think there is a way in which we approach democracy and thinking about this Tocquevillian model, Hahrie, that you had noted, as if mobilization of civil society in all kinds of ways, if it's rich and if it's dynamic, should allow us to not only arrive at better democratic outcomes, but also greater participation and responsiveness. And as you highlighted, civil society is not only facing challenges to be civic in a context of COVID and distrust, but civil society can generate non-civic groups. And so how one actually deals with a mobilized society that includes both civic and non-civic groups, I think, is a huge question. So I really want to thank you for raising that in general, and especially in light of race issues. So if I could, since that was going to be my first question as well,
Oh, sorry.
I'd like to actually, no, it's great. I want to bring actually, if I could, Steve and Rick into dialogue with one another. You already referenced one another in your comments as well, which is both of you, and Hahrie, you as well, highlight that democracy is really predicated on a certain level of comfort with uncertainty, a certain level of comfort with not quite knowing what is coming down the pike, but also a certain expectation that there's going to be an alternation in voices, an alternation in power, a set of shared boundaries of norms and of tolerance and engagement. So you all highlighted that in a certain way, and the sort of existential questions that we're all facing coming into this election. Both Steve and Rick noted that for us to be able to move forward, we have to think about institutional reform, although I think Rick highlighted that institutional reform is happening in small ways, maybe in big ways that have to occur too. I think, Steve, you were kind of more hesitant maybe to focus on those smaller reforms, maybe because you think about serial replacement, and we're focused on the larger reforms. So I guess I'd like to have the two of you converse with one another about which institutional reforms do you think are most critical in the aftermath of this election to have a more stable and dynamic election, democratic system, and not only how one would prioritize those, but given the distribution of power that is so unequal that everybody noted, how do you build the political coalitions to actually do that? Whether or not we're talking about the courts or the legislature or elections. So it's a big question, but I think both of you highlighted how key institutional reform is and how difficult it is to do the big reforms. And if you want to talk about courts or elections, electoral institutions, I leave that up to you. Thank you.
Should I start?
And well, sure.
So first of all, I just want to say, I thought that Rick made a great point, reminding us how far we've come since the early spring in terms of this election. I'm not an expert on elections, but I was certainly worried 6-7 months ago. I'm still worried, but that we risked a low turnout election, and Rick's right. We almost all of our state governments have ensured that that's not going to happen, which is great. In terms of institutional reforms, I'm gonna talk more, Deborah, about the reforms that I think we need, and less about how to get there, because I have no freaking idea how to get there. I think we need reforms of two types. First of all, where norms of forbearance have broken down, for example, regarding the filibuster, regarding the appointment or the nomination of Supreme Court justices, I think we probably need to respond with formalization. I think it's great when you can rely on norms of restraint, but when those you often have to formalize. One example, really basic example, we went for 150 years without a constitutional limit on reelection, presidential reelection. After a precedent set by Washington, in effect, no president sought a third term. When FDR busted through that, we very quickly formalized the rule. I think we're going to, and another example is conflict of interest laws. For most of our modern history, we kind of could assume that the president wasn't going to step in and use the White House to make $1 or $1 million. And it's only with Trump sort of busting through that we realize we're going to have to write some new rules. So some of this, I think, is just going to require formalization. My guess, personally, I think that a set of formal reforms regarding the Supreme Court nomination is probably preferable to say court packing. I also think, and Dan Ziblatt and I have a op-ed coming out in a few days arguing this, that we need a set of reforms getting us closer to majority rule. That we have a serious problem of what is essentially partisan minority rule that we need to correct. And so I think HR 1 and HR 4 passed by the House but not by the Senate allow for a series of steps that will make it easier to register and to vote, which is part of the solution. Restoring the Voting Rights Act, I think, is clearly part of the solution. But also, and this is harder to get to, but in an ideal world, elimination of the Electoral College, but also a series of reforms that will empower majorities. And I would start with the end of the filibuster. The filibuster does not work as it used to work. It used to be used with restraint. It is now simply a tool. It's simply a minority veto. And in an earlier era, when parties were not disciplined, where they negotiated coalitions cross-party, that may not have been a huge deal. But in today's system, I think it's a recipe for dysfunctionality. We need to, if this democracy is going to function and is going to retain legitimacy in this context of polarization, we need to take institutional steps back, or at least towards majority rule. Let me stop there.
So I guess I would start by saying there are lots of small scale reforms that I can imagine, but just because things are very, very bad doesn't mean that there are reforms that are going to fix the problems. It depends, how deep they are, how much they're a product of our culture. One of the paradoxes, of course, with the US Constitution is because it's so old, we had much less experience with democratic processes and institutions. And so we have hardwired certain things into the Constitution that we probably wouldn't create that way on a blank slate today, but they become very, very hard to change. And let me just make a specific point about the Senate. At the time the Senate was formed, the population disparity, the ratio between the largest state and the smallest state was 13-1. And Virginia, of course, was the largest state, and about half the population of Virginia was not quite half, but close, were slaves. Slaves weren't voting, of course. And so if you actually focus on the ratio of people who were voting in the largest state to the smallest state, it was about 6-1. And now we're in a situation where it's something like 70-something to 1, California to Wyoming. And that's it's not the same institution in that sense. It might make sense to keep a Senate. Lots of countries do have regional-based, geographic-based representation in a higher chamber, but we could change that ratio if we could amend the Constitution to do it so that it wasn't nearly as out of kilter as it's become. With the Supreme Court, like many of our processes and our institutions, there's been one crashing through of some traditional understanding or principle or norm. I don't even like the word norm sometimes. I think these are fundamental principles of democratic governance. They're deeper than what I think of when I think of good norms. And it's a terrible downward spiral. We all know it can take generations to build up these principles and understandings. And they can come unraveled very quickly because it becomes a tit for tat game. Why am I going to sit by passively when the other side is doing these horrible things? And there's no way to dig out of that dynamic that's very easy. There's no third party outside force that can come in and kind of broker a deal. The stakes in Supreme Court appointments have gotten way too high. We should not have our major political battles being about an appointment to the Supreme Court. I am in favor if we could get it done, but it's a hard row, hard row to hoe of the proposal to change the system so that justices have 18-year terms. I actually think that's even a little too long. I might shorten it, but so that they come up at an even number of appointments for each term of a presidency. I think that would be great. And I don't know how likely it is we'll get there. I also want to highlight another problem about our system, and it's not just our system, it's Western democracies in general that we haven't really talked about here, that I think does show how difficult it is to unravel some of these problems. We don't just have polarization, but we have what I call political fragmentation, which means even our political parties are deeply fractionated in ways they weren't so, in different ways in the modern period. You see the this fragmentation in Europe with the rise of third and fourth parties, the breakdown of the dominant center-right, center-left coalitions in a lot of these democracies. It makes governance so much more difficult, difficult to form governments, difficult to keep governments intact, fragile governments, always on the risk of losing majority support. In the two-party system in the US, it takes the form of the two parties being, yes, very polarized, but also fragmented. Individual politicians can stand as kind of independent free agents now in a way they couldn't in the past. They can raise money through the internet. They can reach an audience, through social media. They can find their constituents. They don't have to be their voters. And so they don't feel beholden to party leadership to take tough votes. When deals are brokered in our separated power system, it tends to come from party leaders in the two parties finding some compromise and then really bringing their members along to support that. And when they lose the ability to bring their members along, the quintessential example recently, of course, is the Republicans with control of government not being able to deliver on healthcare when that was the signature issue for them in election after election. And they suddenly can't even keep their own majority behind that. Now, that as a policy matter, I prefer that Obamacare stay intact, but that's a sign. Look at the way they consumed speakers of the House, John Boehner, Paul Ryan. This is fragmentation of the parties. I think if the Democrats get unified control, there will be certain things, maybe early on, that they're unified on. I think you'll see this fragmentation play out there as well. And that's a product of a lot of things, but the communications revolution is a huge driver of that. And I see no way to put that back in the bottle. I'd love to know how we might do it. So, these problems are deep. And given the things that are hardwired into the Constitution, some of them will be very, very tough to change. Does that give you enough anxiety?
It just adds to the anxiety, yes.
Okay. So Steve, in his talk, presented two prongs for improvement. I'm going back to the less anxious side, appealing to your inner optimist. So one prong was reform, and all the paths that you've traced, and which Steve alluded to, seem very difficult and maybe impossible. The other one was for the Republican Party, which I completely agree is fragmented, to change for possibly quite rational reasons its identity from being a pure white party. That is, change whose votes they're competing for. So that's the other prong. So that doesn't require institutional change, at least in principle, on Steve's account. But it may be, and who's going to be that? Who is it going to be? So now the Democrats seem to have captured a lot of traditional Republican-leaning constituencies, highly educated people, college degrees, things like that. The Republicans have moved downscale a little bit. So it seems like there's, you could imagine a different kind of cosmopolitan electorate that is appealing in different ways to the different parties. It's precisely the fragmentation of the parties that may make that transition possible. I mean, as you know, Karl Rove has always argued for, a big tent Republican Party specifically to go after Hispanics. But there could be others who want to go for different constituencies. So my question, therefore, to all three of you is it possible for, things within the system as it functions, with the Senate, the way it's apportioned, with the stakes, what they are, for the parties themselves to be, because of the fragmented internal competition within the parties, to lead in a more sanguine direction. I mean sanguine in the happy sense, not the bloody sense.
Hahrie, you want to start?
Sure. Yeah. So I think that this. So let me sort of step. One thing I was thinking about when you're talking is, so this question about like what direction the Republican Party is going to go, I think is a really important question. And one of the things that I feel like, I'm seeing is that there's, among the sort of people on the ground, I think there's a sense that there's not a party that meets the needs for a lot of people out there, right? That there are a lot of people that feel like neither the Democratic nor the Republican Party stands for them, and they're not really sure where to go. And so in that sense, it feels like both parties have this opportunity to sort of create a different kind of, to create a different kind of tent, right? And capture portions of the electorate. And one little piece of data that I'll offer is, so I'm doing this project right now on evangelicalism, and I was talking to this pastor of one of the big mega churches in the United States. And so this is someone who pastors a church that's over 40,000 people a week, right? And so like back when we used to be able to gather in person, they would get 40,000 people a week to sort of show up in person. And there's a number of these kind of churches around the country. And despite all the news that is out there about the evangelicals being a huge part of the Trump base, his hypothesis was that if you look at the evangelical mega churches that are sort of 20,000 or above, that they're starting to preach and move in a different kind of evangelicalism than the mega churches that are 10,000 or less. A mega church is defined as a church that's more than 2,000 people. So sort of between like 2,000 and 10,000 people, and and we went and looked at the data, and in fact, if you look at sort of how these churches reacted after George Floyd, for example, the mega churches that were 10,000 or more were reacting in a really different way, making statements about racial reconciliation, or sort of at least like speaking out on the issue in a way that a lot of the mega churches that were more like 2,000 or 5,000 people were not. And so I point to this story only in the sense that like I think there's this like growing rift in sort of parts of the base of the Republican Party, where there's going to depending on, well, in some ways, no matter what happens in the election, but certainly, depending on if Trump loses, I think there's going to be a real reckoning with sort of how the party wants to respond to the needs of people that were not only kind of new constituencies, but potentially its core constituencies as well.
So I think it is possible that the Republicans will reform, and that a broadening of the Republican coalition, which, as you pointed out, John, the Republican coalition could be reshuffled in diverse ways. I think it's entirely possible. I think it's the most likely outcome. It's why I'm not as pessimistic as at least some of my colleagues. And when will it happen? It'll happen most likely when the Republicans lose, when they suffer an electoral thrashing. That's when parties change strategy, when it doesn't work. There is a hitch, though, which is our counter-majoritarian institutions, right? Republicans don't need to win and sustain national electoral majorities to retain a lot of power. Obviously, in the Senate, they know they can win the presidency without 50+% of the vote, and they can control or exert quite a bit of power, protect themselves in the courts as well. And so in a more majoritarian electoral system, I think the Republicans would already be feeling intense pressure to adapt. But our counter-majoritarian institutions, their effects right now are kind of dulling that incentive. And as a result, that plus primaries. I mean, the Republican Party leadership saw very clearly in 2013 that they needed to broaden the base. And but Trump went another direction and demonstrated, I think, that the electorate, I think there is still a considerably sized constituency for some sort of ethno-nationalist appeal within the party. And I think that primaries are also going to stall the process of adaptation.
Thank you. Rick, do you want to jump in?
Yes. When parties lose a national election in the United States, historically, there's often a debate within the party. Did they lose because they weren't pure enough and they should become more ideologically pure, or did they lose because they weren't appealing enough to centrist and moderate voters? And it's not uncommon for it to take 2 election defeats in the presidential election before the moderates are able to say, you see, because it's often the case that there's a purification after that first big loss. So we don't know how quickly, any adaptation would take place within either party if their candidate loses in the election this fall. It might take more than 1 election cycle to do it. The other thing is, in a big picture sense, looking at politics across Europe and the United States, we have gone through a radical transformation in the configuration of party politics. And so it's not just that the Democratic Party in the United States, which used to be the party of less well-off voters, less well-educated voters, the New Deal kind of Democratic Party. It's not just that the Democratic Party in the United States is now the party of the affluent and the high educated people and minority voters, which holds that together. This has happened to the Democratic parties or the parties of the left across Europe. And at the same time, the parties of the right have become the parties of the lower educated voters and the less well-off voters. This is a huge transformation from the way our politics fundamentally was in Western democracy since World War II. And so that tells you something very, very big has been happening. And the parties are trying to grapple with this and figure out what it means and where they go. I actually think the Democratic Party in the United States has not felt as much pressure from these developments as the parties of the left in Europe because of the unique issues of race and minority interests in the United States and historical, development of those issues with the parties. And so you have, for now, working class African Americans and Hispanics who are not voting with other working class voters, but voting for the Democratic Party. And that's what allows the Democratic Party to hang on to the extent it's hanging on, to the extent Joe Biden wins. And Trump, of course, is a unique figure, which also obviously changes the dynamics some in the United States. So if the Democratic Party, especially post-Trump, has difficulty holding on to Hispanic and African-American working class voters, and our politics becomes even more like the politics in Europe, that's going to pose big challenges to the Democratic Party. Similarly, as Steve said, the Republican Party went through this soul searching after 2012. They produced a very major report, an audit of the party that was supposed to tell the party how it could become a modern party. And what they had to do to appeal to working class Hispanic voters. And then it got abandoned when Trump became the candidate. So one of the reforms we don't talk about that plays a far bigger role in our politics than we realize is the reforms we made in the 1970s to the presidential process, where we shifted from a system in which party figures from throughout the country had significant say over who became the party nominee to this purely kind of plebiscitary or populist system in which the primary elections determine who becomes the candidate. Steve talked about the problems with the primaries, and that is true at all levels. Primaries are not the wonderful progressive era reform that they were thought to be initially. They're lower turnout. There are issues about whether, there's debates in political science, but certainly many politicians worry primarily about being primaried from the even more extreme fringes of their party. Should we consider getting rid of primary elections? I think that wouldn't be such a bad idea. We can talk about what would replace it. Should we try to find a way to build back into the presidential nominations process some meaningful role for the party figures from around the country, national, state, and local, who have a lot of experience with people in government, and give them at least some weight that they completely lost with these changes in the 1970s. So I'm not sure how much of an answer that is to your question, but it just, again, it goes to, as we start pursuing this, just how deep and structural the transformations Western democracies are facing, and why it's not so easy to think there are, a few knobs we could turn here and there, and change the situation dramatically to a less toxic, less divisive place.
Great. Well, I just wanted to say before we turn to the questions from those of you who are on the seminar with us, that I think all of these fascinating comments bring us back to Hahri's final comment in her opening presentation about the circumstances under which one can build a racial solidarity that's not based on making groups invisible and assimilating them, but finding ways to incorporate them. So I just hope that we can turn back to you to fold that into your response. But I know we have to bring other questions in. So how do we build racial solidarity of the sort you noted?
Yes, thank you so much, Deborah, for that. And I'm going to go to a few of the questions, and I would ask if Deborah and John want to answer them as well. I wanted to make kind of two sociological and observations from a sociologist to my mostly political science colleagues. And one follows on Deborah's point, which is, I was struck by both Stephen and Hahrie sort of leading us to an aware, conversation about multiracial democracy, but that there was a kind of mismatch with the mechanisms that Steve offered us for change. And so I'm kind of trying to think through that, and maybe this also does point a little bit to some of what Hahrie offered. The other observation I wanted to make was, I wondered if in the conversation about mechanisms and kind of how the political process is working in this moment, if we're underappreciating externalities like, or not even externality, like the pandemic. So I kind of wonder if our kind of theorizing about the election is really under appreciating the fact that, Rick referenced this in his comments about the electoral process, whether or not the pandemic might just so kind of upturn the apple cart that the way that we typically think about the mechanisms that are available for us for, kind of reconciliation after an election and these sorts of things might not be available. And thus that the chaos that we're anxious about may not be amenable to kind of being soothed because there's all of this other unrest. So I just offer those as observations. And we've got several terrific questions. I'm going to start with one from Patricia Rosenfield, our colleague who's an economist. With appreciation for the provocative scope and depth of all of the presentations and questions and comments, I would like to return to the question of effectiveness of other institutions besides political institutions, educational, cultural, philanthropic, and reducing societal anxieties, enlarging civil society spaces, and promoting democratic reforms. If not in the short term, what about the medium and long term, especially as the US becomes a minority-majority country? Anybody who wants to jump in for that one?
I can jump in here. So I mean, I agree with the premise of the question, right? That I think a lot of times, in political science conversations, especially, like we get into this conversation about the reforms that are needed for our political institutions, which of course are voluminous and important in the ways that we've already discussed. But there's sort of this underlying assumption, like that. Sometimes I like to sort of call it like, if we build it, they will come, right? And I think that part of what we're seeing is that, democracy also depends on people consenting to being governed, and part of what we're seeing, for example, around issues of policing is that there are communities where people are withdrawing their consent to be policed, right? And these possibilities, I think, are sort of out there. And so, so I feel like that a lot of the kind of other, civic institutions in society, educational, cultural, philanthropic, all of them then play a large role in creating these alternate spaces. And so one thing I would say is that sometimes I think when people talk about civil society, they feel like it feels so like loosey-goosey and mushy that it's less satisfying than talking about like a constitutional reform that feels really concrete and everything like that. And one thing I would argue is that I think that if we can bring more conversation about structure into civil society, then that it better gives us handle through which we can think about these questions of like, what does the structure of the kind of organizations that we need to look like, and that there are sort of concrete things that we can do. And, on that point, I'll just sort of, just to pick up a little bit on what Deborah said, I'll say, to to the conversation that we're having, like, I feel like clearly the demographics sort of point to the fact that some party has to figure out how to create a multiracial governing majority, right? And that the kind of standard left-right dimension that we have may not necessarily be the right one, because the issues that divide different communities are sort of cross-cutting in so many different ways. And that's where I think this conversation about creating internal solidarity or internal democracy within some of these other civic spaces becomes really important, because that's how we're going to figure out sort of what it might look like and how to create the kind of coalitions that we need across boundaries of difference. And so, I guess I would just argue that, for all the kind of challenges that we're seeing, our losers going to be tolerant of an outcome that they don't like? Are people going to be able to sort of create the kind of multiracial solidarity that we need? Like, all those things, I think, depend tremendously on our informal political institutions as providing opportunities for people to learn how to do that kind of work that is so vital.
Thank you. Others want to weigh in on this question? We have plenty others, if not.
Really briefly, I may be more optimistic and maybe somewhat Pollyannish, but I think the Democratic Party has actually gone a long way towards building or representing that emerging multi-ethnic Democratic coalition that's been in emergence. I think that the Trump presidency, I hesitate to call it a silver lining, but one of the products of the Trump presidency has been to accelerate the crystallization of that multiracial Democratic majority in opposition. That majority is strongest, is most robust among the younger generation, but the numbers are pretty solid. The support for what I would call the pillars of multiracial democracy, majority support for the pillars of multiracial democracy are there. And I think that we saw quite a bit of it this summer with the broad multiracial support that we saw for the protests. And the question is getting that majority to power. And that's why I think I take issue a bit, Alondra, with one of your observations. I think the institutional reforms I was talking about very much align with that. I mean, the reforms that we're thinking about would enable what is already an electoral majority and a societal majority to come to power and to govern more easily. That's the goal.
Thank you. So I'm mindful of time. I'm going to read two questions that I think loop certainly Hahrie, Steve, and Rick into the conversation, and certainly Deborah and John, if you want to weigh in as well. The first for Professor Levitsky, but I think Professor Yashar as well. Americans are less satisfied with their democracy. Similarly, according to a report in The Economist in 2018, Latino Barometro conducted a survey that finds that 71% of Latin Americans are dissatisfied with how democracy works. This is a rise from 51% who say they were dissatisfied with the way democracy works in 2009. What are the similarities and differences you see for this trend in both the US and Latin America? Do these trends portend that democracy is in trouble, or can dissatisfaction with how democracy works create possibilities for improving the democratic system? And then at a higher level of abstraction, for any who want to respond, is the crisis we are facing in the contemporary USA the idea of democracy or the way it is being practiced? E.g., or for example, has democracy run its course in the American experiment, or do the excesses and flaws of present practices need to be corrected? Rick, you want to start?
Well, my first reaction to that question is to be reminded of a book I read a number of years ago called, this is like 15 years ago, I think, 10 years ago, When China Rules the World. And the thesis of that book was that the West assumes that as China becomes more economically prosperous, gets more integrated into the world's economy, it's going to want to become more like us. But the book argued, to the contrary, China is going to want to maybe export its model to surrounding countries. And democratic governments get in trouble when they can't deliver on the major sort of policy demands of people over and over again. And so, I have great faith in American democracy, I want to say, and I'm an optimist about democracy in the long run. But it is a risk for democracies if we can't develop the political capacity to address a whole range of issues, whatever the solutions that are major issues for people, whether it's climate change, whether it's labor markets, wages, whether it's immigration, we can go on and on and on. Government is just not addressing these issues effectively in the United States. And at some point, people will look to other models and say, why is that country doing so much better than we are? So I don't know what the truth is about how China did or didn't manage the pandemic. By all accounts, it seems like they did a much better job than the UK and the US did. This will pose a challenge as a country like China becomes more and more successful in the way that the Soviet Union never did. I think it will, for more countries, start looking like an alternative model. Now, am I going to bet on democracy? Yes. Have we been through these similar kinds of periods? The 1930s, there were these same debates. Look at Mussolini. Look at the Air Force Italy has. Look at how much more efficient things are. That turned out not to prove true, and that would be my bet in the long run. But we have to develop the capacity for government to actually deliver something, whatever the compromises might be, on the dominant issues that people are concerned about. Otherwise, at some point, people will get alienated.
I can quickly comment on the U.S. Latin America comparison, although then I want to hear from Deborah because she's really smart. Rick's got it absolutely right. Governments get into trouble when they fail to deliver the goods over time. And that is happening in somewhat different reasons in both the United States and Latin America. In Latin America, there are a bunch of reasons, and there's a lot of variation across countries, but most Latin American states don't work very well. And so whatever is promised in campaigns, and even laws and policies that are on the books are often implemented poorly, and they're often implemented unevenly, both across territory and across social class. And so the gap between what is promised and what is sort of put forth in the newspapers and what people see in their day-to-day lives is enormous. And when governments of left, right, and center consistently fail to deliver basic public goods, whether it's paving the roads, equipping the schools and the health clinics, providing basic security to citizens, really basic functions of government. When governments of all stripes consistently fail to do that, people start to lose faith, and that is definitely happening across Latin America. In the U.S., I think it's somewhat more about dysfunctionality, as Rick put it. We're unable as a polity, not that the state doesn't work, but unable as a polity to solve basic problems, whether it is immigration or employment or healthcare or COVID-19. And I think it's primarily the fact that citizens are seeing that the biggest problems that they're concerned about are consistently not being addressed or certainly not resolved by our governments. That's leading to this growing discontent.
Thanks. Deborah, the smartest person we know.
Oh, well, thanks for that shout out, Steve. We can talk about that later, but there's so much to say with all these questions. I will just start with an anecdote, which is any Latin Americanist knows the phrase by Vargas from Brazil, who's known to have said, "For my friends, anything, for my enemies, the law." And I start with that because there's oftentimes a sense in many places, not only in Latin America, but I think increasingly in the United States, that institutions are far from neutral. Any social scientist knows that no institutions are neutral, but we hope that they're going to provide a more or less a level playing field, more or less set of common rules. And I think in Latin America for a long time, for the reasons that Steve noted, there's been a sense that those institutions are not only neutral, but they favor clearly certain actors over another. They get deployed in certain ways. I think in the United States, we've had the hope and certainly the civic dream that those institutions should provide for an equal and level playing field, where that's actually declined over time. I would say one of the things that Steve and I have, we've actually co-authored on some of this in a different context, that we've really highlighted that makes Latin America different than the United States, but in the United States it's becoming more prevalent, is a deep sense of inequality. So it's not just that we don't have a common sense of civicness and civil society. It's not just that states are sometimes weak and used in political ways. It's not just a sense of a highly polarized partisan situation, but that there are deep socioeconomic inequalities. And I want to bring in Harrie's comment here, coupled with racial and ethnic and other inequalities that are coming to the fore. And where those inequalities are deep, and this comes back to Rick's comment about different models in Europe and the like, where those inequalities are deeper, it is a higher road, it is a harder road for democracies to travel. And that's where questions of redistribution and social policy are critical. So I'll say one final thing that I think comes across these comments, which is when we think about democratic governance and democratic stability, we've been oftentimes operating at a very high level of abstraction at the national level, but a lot of the comments and examples that we've given are about the challenges at the local level and in between elections, right? This sense of, can you hold governments to account? Can you actually participate? Can you actually get services? Are you actually going to have a better life in this context? And that's where I think it's not just elections and elected officials. It comes back to the states that coincide, whether or not it's the police, whether or not it's the person at the tax office, whether or not it's somebody at the DMV. You want to know that those are functioning alongside. And I think inequalities make that even harder. And I'll stop there.
John, do you want to have the last word? We're at time. You're muted. Let me see if we can.
Undo it. Okay.
There you are.
I want to agree with what Deborah said, which was, at least in the United States, we have these state and local governments. We have elected and non-elected officials. In some ways, Trump has brought out some good aspects of those localities in New York and California and other places. Sometimes the debates that come out in the street have divided people and but they've opened up issues. And so I think there's a lot of vibrance in democracy that goes all the way through the whole system. So as dysfunctional as the American national institutions can be on Steve's account, which I largely agree with, how much it is a form of minority rule, which is increasingly problematic, it's still the case that there are more majoritarian aspects down below in many of the states and localities. And I think they're uneven, of course, as thousands of government. There's something like 150,000 governments in the United States. They're going to be somewhat uneven in their performance, but on the whole, there's lots of scope for participation and democracy in the ways that Hahrie pointed out, and Theda Scotchwell and others have pointed out. So I think there's room for hope throughout the system, even if it's not working so well at the national level for certain periods of time.
Thank you. Well, thank you, John and Deborah, for being the council's co-conspirators and bringing this conversation together in an endeavor to, I think, soothe some of our electoral anxieties with kind of deeply sourced analysis and great research. Thank you very much, and also for your leadership of the Anxieties of Democracy program. Professor Pildes, Professor Levitsky, Professor Han, thank you very much for your wonderful insights. That were, I think we'll hang on until the 3rd, and hopefully after that as well. And we're deeply grateful. And thank you all for joining us, and best wishes for the rest of your day.
Thanks to all of you.